Welcome back, and welcome to our next module as we return to Soren Kierkegaard as we continue to explore the philosophical branch of existentialism. In the last module on Kierkegaard, we looked at his work Fear and Trembling, where we first are exposed to his concept of existence and the question of existence, and really how he answers it, how he moves through three levels: the aesthetical, the ethical, and the religious, trying to move beyond the angst of this world towards faith, towards when we finally take a leap of faith, and that is what is able to reach a fully human life, to be truly ourselves. In this work, The Sickness unto Death, we again are faced with Kierkegaard's idea of existentialism. However, that angst, that despair, so to speak, is really the focus, the entire focus of this work, where Kierkegaard looks at this question of what does it mean to be human and how is it intimately related to the fact that we are all in a state of angst and despair. And then while he focuses completely on the idea of despair and how it affects ourselves as humans, there are some glimmers of how do we move beyond this despair. And if we take his thoughts in The Sickness unto Death, coupled with what he wrote in Fear and Trembling, we will see that while we are human beings whose selves are always in some form of despair and angst, the act of faith does help us to move beyond despair, or at the very least to deal with it, so that way we can be authentically ourselves. So to this point, let's take a moment to recap a little bit why Kierkegaard is considered an existentialist. So if we look back to Aristotle's metaphysics, the questions of the nature of reality, focus on the relationship between existence and essence. If you remember this, essentially, existence is our concrete being in the world, while essence is what our perfect being would be, what we are boiled down to, so to speak. It is what we would be without original sin. And remember, Kierkegaard is going to be a religious existentialist, a Christian. And so he does see things through not only a class, in part through a classist worldview, even though he's very much influenced by the thinking of his time, but he's also going to be influenced by how sin mars or ruins, so to speak, what humans were supposed to be. So because he focuses more on our existence than our essence, he's considered an existentialist. He does this because of the belief that due to humanity's original sin, we'll never reach our essence. And so humanity's despair comes from our inability to accept the fact that we'll never reach our essence, that our potentiality will never be reached this side of the grave, and that our despair comes from our attempting to, or our failure to attempt to be ourselves apart from our source. So in other words, Kierkegaard is going to claim that humans are in a constant state of despair because we can't accept that we will never reach our true essence this side of the grave. And whenever we attempt or fail to attempt to do this, to actually reach ourselves and our essence, and we do it on our own, apart from the source of our existence, which is God, then we also feel this despair. So for Kierkegaard, our existence is kind of a journey through varying degrees of despair. And the more that we can come to a sense of self depends on how we wade through that despair. So let's talk real brief what he means by the self. So according to Kierkegaard, human beings can be considered a synthesis. Synthesis means a relationship between two factors. So he sees humans as a synthesis between the finite, you might think of the material, this immediate world, and the infinite. You might think of the divine, omnipotence, omniscience. So the finite and the infinite. And this is kind of correlating to what previous philosophers had shared with the idea of a mind-body composite, or a body-soul composite, that there's more to the human being than a physical body. And Kierkegaard nods to this in his sense of self, albeit in his own way, in his own language. The human beings, we are more than just a physical body. And so he says, rather than saying we are mind, body, or body, soul composite, he talks about how human beings are a synthesis, a relationship between the finite and the infinite. And this despair is going to come out of the tension of these two. It's interesting how he describes the self. He talks about the self in terms of relationship, which I think is very appropriate in the sense that humans are made for relationship. And it's a nod to his Christian influence. That remember, in the Christian worldview, humanity is made in the image of a triune God. And to say that the Christian God is triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is to say that God is a singular relationship. So then to say that we are made in the image of God is to say that human beings are naturally relational. So with that context in mind, we can better understand what Kierkegaard is referring to when he says the self, and this is his words, is a relation that relates itself to itself. And in doing this can relate itself to others. So the self is a relation that relates itself to itself. It's to say that the self, to say that we're talking about the self is not that we're necessarily talking about our physical bodies, but almost our awareness, our consciousness that we exist, and our ability to figure out how we exist in space and time by relating ourselves to everything around us. Perhaps think of his concept of the self like sonar. Sonar sends out a wave, and then it bounces back against something and comes back. And that's how we know where we are when we can't see in the water through sonar between the space between objects is that sonar wave. Well, think of that sonar wave as his sense of the self. It's how we come to understand how we relate ourselves to everything around us, to be conscious of what it means to be ourselves. He uses the term, he uses a description that the self is spirit. And this is again related to the Christian concept of the Trinity. To say the self is spirit. So at best, perhaps he thinks that we are a finite, infinite composite. So you have a mind-body composite or a body-soul composite. For Kierkegaard, humans are more of a finite and infinite composite, or a spirit-body composite. So he uses the comparison to the Trinity. So you might think of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit being the Father and the Son relating to one another. And that act of relating is itself being, is spirit, in the great mystery that is God. So the human has a relation to the finite and the infinite, and the self is the relating of these two relations. So you might think then, if we're to take this language further, that we are a human self composite, that the human part of us is us as body, as physicality, and the self is our understanding of this human composite and how this human composite relates to the finite and to the infinite. What's important to note, and this is going to be a key piece of understanding where despair comes from for Kierkegaard, is that the self does not establish its own relation. Again, the self is dependent on something outside of itself that's been put there first. For Kierkegaard, that is God. And so whenever we try to understand the self or ourselves apart from our source, apart from God, we develop a greater sense of angst and despair. So the best chance that we have, according to Kierkegaard, to fully understanding ourselves is to try to seek an understanding of ourselves through our source, which would be God. But there's a problem with this. Again, if you look at his Christian worldview, the understanding of humanity and its creation is also linked to its fall, original sin. And so this is going to pose a really big problem for Kierkegaard in how we fail to understand ourselves, and this is going to be the launching pad for his concept of despair. This sickness unto death is this despair. So it's the whole theme of the book. So there's no self that is free of despair. And that's a big point of Kierkegaard, is that every human is in some level of despair. We can't escape it. If you do not feel like you're in despair, it's not that you're just not simply conscious of being in despair. That's the first formulation of despair. It's three main levels of despair. The first one is that you are in despair. You're just not aware that you are. This doesn't mean that humans can't be happy. You can be happy, according to Kierkegaard, and also be in despair. But because of original sin, we're mired in our existence. Our existence is imperfect. And this is very much him drawing from the Christian worldview, that in Christianity, human beings were made in this perfect happiness, this perfect relation, again, relation to God, that our sense of self was intimately related to God. And original sin broke that connection with God, broke that relation. And so our existence is now can never be perfect, at least this side of the grave. It can never be a perfect happiness. We can be happy, but it's mired. Our existence is marred. And so this is the sickness of despair. This sickness of despair, which he speaks of, it's a sin that leads to despair in the human condition. So this is why Kierkegaard lands on the branch of existentialism. Because remember, he doesn't think us reaching our essence is possible because of this break in our human condition through original sin. We can only understand or ask the question of what it means to exist, rather than realizing, can we ever reach our potentiality? And while admittedly he does make some concessions with like the Knights of Faith and Abraham and moving to the third tier, I think he would also admit that's very hard to get to because of this reason, because of the marred piece of our existence and the constant state of despair that we're in. So he's going to limit his language on saying how much we can truly relate to God and really the possibility of rational knowledge. Again, remember, rational knowledge can be known in stage 2, but not in stage 3, the religious. You simply have to take a leap of faith. So there comes a point where he says you can't know, you just have to take a leap of faith because our existence is imperfect. We're in a state of despair. So let's now get into what Kierkegaard means exactly by despair and the main formulations of despair that he puts forward. So simply put, despair is a sickness of one's spirit. That's what he means by the sickness unto death, is that while we might think that physical death is the worst kind of death, the real death, he opens the entire work of sickness unto death by talking about the raising of Lazarus in the Gospels by Jesus. So in Fear and Trembling, he uses the story of Abraham. In Sickness unto Death, he uses the story of Lazarus, and he talks about physical death. But he uses it to explain that physical death is not the worst thing that can actually happen to us. Ultimately, what he's going to get to is the worst kind of death is this sickness unto death that he calls despair. Despair is actually worse than a physical death. And despair is a sickness of one's spirit. Remember, if he says the self is sickness, is essentially a sickness of oneself, of never fully reaching oneself. It's the misrelation or the misunderstanding of oneself. So it's what keeps us from moving from understanding our existence to our essence, our potentiality, what we could be. And when we fail to move toward our potential, what we could be, and to be who we are fully meant to be, we are ultimately in a state of despair. Well, if we couple this to the point that Kierkegaard says we're always in a state of despair, then we could probably postulate and argue that he would also say ourselves are always incomplete this side of the grave, that we're always working towards understanding ourselves and our potentiality. But I think it could be fair to assess then that for Kierkegaard, we may only reach our full potential, we may only reach our full sense of self when we finally return to God. Because again, remember, we can't reach our full sense of self apart from our source. So it could probably stand to argue that we can only know that after death. He talks about three main forms of despair in the central part of his book. And he goes into more detail of the different sins of despair. But in general, he divides despair up into two categories: unconscious despair and conscious despair. And that this spans three kinds, so two conscious kinds and one unconscious kind. First is the despair that is not conscious of despair. So are not aware that we are despairing. The second is despair not to will to be oneself, and then despair to will to be oneself. So let's break these down in a second. Ultimately, the goal is to root out despair. When despair is completely rooted out, the self rests completely in he from whom the self has been given, God. And the self accepts the gift in complete receptivity. It takes the leap of faith into God, into the religious, and returns to its source. Again, this may only be possible on the other side, so to speak, in the great beyond, in heaven. And that is why our selves are never fully complete this side of the grave. But it's enough to say that despair is this sickness, this misrelating, misunderstanding of oneself. And we're always working on ourselves, always trying to reach our potential. And when we're able to root out despair, we can better do that. When we can't root out despair, then it keeps us from being ourselves. So the first formulation of despair not to be conscious of despair. So this despair is brought by someone who lives a superficial life. You might think of his first stage of living, the aesthetical. Someone who is very fixated on the finite, the material things in life. And so they're so focused on the material things in life, they don't even realize they are in despair. And this is one that I think really hits home, that in the midst of the angst and anxiety of life, we try to fill it with things. We try to buy things. We try to get relationships to fill this void, this what you might think of the cliche phrase, the used phrase of an existential crisis. That we are in a state of an existential crisis of angst of this world, that the world is just despair. And so we try to fill it with physical things. We try to buy happiness. We try to buy our way out of anxiety. And that becomes enough for us. And so there's so much despair that we become numb to it, that we don't know anything better. And when you don't know anything better, you think what you have is great. And so this is what Kierkegaard means by being in despair and not even realizing it. We are so ignorant to the reality of existence that we happen to be content with so little. And this stems, he said, from a life totally in pursuit of pleasure, where that's our only goal, or where a life where we focus too much on abstract thoughts. So he even in this regard might criticize the philosopher who's so stuck in abstract thought about theories that could never potentially be or are not connected to real life or the real world around us or actual experience. We just kind of get lost in our own thoughts. If you think of the movie Inside Out, for instance, which talks about emotions, and there's the characters joy, sadness, anger, and disgust, you think about the great divide, where individuals who are in the zone are floating above, but those who their zone have turned into obsession, turned into these monsters, so to speak, that are stuck, their souls are stuck in a state of despair. That's a good image for what Kierkegaard is putting forward by this first formulation of despair, when we're so focused in pleasure and an obsession of abstract thought that we are just a monster. We're in despair, even if we don't realize it. For him, this is the worst form of despair, as it's so far removed from the truth of life. We're living essentially a fake life, where we're either seeking after pleasure or so busy after abstract thought that we don't even realize the truth of existence and what it means to live. The second formulation of despair, again, moving into the conscious form of despair, ones where we're now aware of it. So unconscious despair means we are not aware that we're in a state of despair, even though we are. The second is that we are aware, but we despair in not to will to be oneself. So this despair is rooted and to want to be different than we are. So there's ourselves, but we try to be different from the self. We try to go about it in a different way apart from God. We don't have the power to change ourselves because we did not create ourselves. We are a gift given by an other. Our source comes from outside ourselves, God. No human created themselves. We have to have the humility to realize we are dependent on another outside of ourselves. It's a myth to say that we're self-made humans. There's no self-made man. We're dependent on others. Remember, the self is a relation. So when we try to move away from that, when we try to not be who we are, not be the self, we enter into a conscious form of despair. When we wish to be other than what we are, we feel an utter finitude and so despair of it. We realize that we can never reach this other self that we're trying to be other than who we are. And so when we realize we can't ever get there, even if intuitively inside of ourselves, then we despair. And this despair is tied up with the immortality of the soul. We will continue to exist even after death, since our self is not primarily rooted or contained in our physical body. Remember, it's not the human physical body, but it's how we relate to others, the act of relating itself. And it is in our being given by God, and we cannot make God stop our existence. So again, for Kierkegaard, the self is intimately related to the source in God. Our existence is related to its essence in God. And if we try to be anything other than that on purpose, then we're going to enter into despair. When we realize that that's the case and we try to go into the opposite direction of, I'm going to try to figure this out on my own, apart from the other, I'm going to try to be something else other than I am, then we despair. Lastly, there's the despair in willing to be oneself. They said, whoa, wait, this makes no sense. You just said that if you try to be anything else other than oneself, then you despair. Yes, but remember that for Kierkegaard, we are a relation between finite and infinite. But at the end of the day, human beings are finite beings. And so, again, this existential crisis comes in where we say, we're not infinite. We're going to come to an end. We wish we could continue. But because we don't have control of the end, every day keeps moving, whether we want it to or not. Every day comes, a day ends. We can't stop time. It keeps moving. We're getting closer and closer to our finite end. So even in willing to be oneself, this is where Kierkegaard is full of angst and is always saying we're in a state of despair. Even when we will ourselves, because we can't control existence, because we cannot choose our existence and are not the cause of it and completely rely on other outside of ourselves, we are in a level of despair. Now, that being said, the first level of not being aware is the worst. So it would stand to reason in Kierkegaard that if you're going to despair, this is the best form of despair. That we are, yes, finite, and we then choose to be ourselves, but we realize that that's the situation. And while we can't do anything about it, and so that does provide some angst. So if you interchange maybe despair with angst a little bit here, because this work is deeply connected. This work of Sickness Unto Death is deeply connected on his work on the cause of angst. So we can interchange that here a little bit. Then if we accept the self, and we accept that we're finite, we'll feel a little bit of angst, some despair, because we can't control it. But we have at least acknowledged that we can't reach the self apart from God, and so we at least work towards that. So while, yes, some despair and angst exists, this is not a hopeless formulation, so to speak. So we move from the three kinds of despair, this sickness of being in complete despair, but so focused on pleasure and material things that we don't even know we're in despair. We're completely ignorant of our existence. To we're conscious of our despair, but we try to be something other than the self. We fight it. And then we realize that there's despair. We try to be the self, but because we can't control our existence and we're finite rather than infinite, we still feel some angst. And this is his focus on anxiety. He explores anxiety more deeply in his work, The Cause of Anxiety. But of course, like I said, it's deeply connected to the idea of despair, and so it's a part of sickness unto death. But all immediacy, all our immediate interactions and consciousness is a form of anxiety to Kierkegaard. It's a form of despair. And the most profound anxiety is directed at nothingness. This is what we mean by an existential crisis. We think of our finiteness and how that there's potentially nothing in life worth doing. What's the point of all of this? What's the point of human existence? And we're tempted to think of, well, nothing. And there's the anxiety sets in. We have this existential crisis about our existence. But it's important to know, why does this crisis even happen? And for Kierkegaard, it's going to be because God exists. Because when we're confronted with a pure finite end, that our lives will end, our existence will end, it reminds us that finiteness is opposite of infiniteness. And so when that ends, it means that we will be severed from the infiniteness that is God. And the opposite of the infiniteness of God's existence is nothingness. So when we're confronted with this nothingness, we get anxiety. So think of it this way. The infinite God and infiniteness is a source of existence, essence, self. Anything done apart from that goes deeper into despair and angst. From the second level of despair, where we try to fight against it, to the first level of despair, where we're so removed from it because we're not even aware of it. And so whenever we try to understand ourselves and we go towards the end of nothingness, away from God, then we feel greater anxiety. When we move towards somethingness, towards God's infiniteness, then we might still feel anxiety because we're in the world, but it's less. And so this is the closest perhaps that we get to a solution of how do we deal with despair. It's intimately linked to, in fear and trembling, to the leap of faith. That ultimately we can be our true selves if we face anxiety and are yet able to move through it. And the way that we're able to move to it, if we connect this to in fear and trembling, is by taking the leap of faith. Only through faith can we move beyond anxiety. So ultimately, Kierkegaard is going to find the answer to despair in Christianity, in Jesus, in God. He is, after all, a religious existentialist. So another way we can look at this is, the further away we go from God into nothingness, the more anxiety and despair. The closer we get to God, we will face less anxiety and despair. We will still be in a state of despair in this world, but eventually when we reach God, we will be out of that despair on the other side of the grave. And so now we can understand what Kierkegaard means by sin. That sin and despair are intimately linked. That sin for Kierkegaard is a willing to be oneself, or to will to be another self after having the knowledge of God. And to sin is to not give your will and self to God. So again, think about it. When we move away into the nothingness, when we move away from God, this is really another way of describing sin. That in the Christian sense, sin is to choose not to love God. So for Kierkegaard, sin is to fight being the self that God made us to be, to move away from our source. When we move towards our source, towards infiniteness, then we're moving towards goodness in a Christian linguistic way, in a manner of speaking that is Christian. We move towards God, towards goodness. When we move away from God and nothingness, when we fight the self, when we choose despair, we sin. And this is very congruent with the Christian understanding of sin, that sin destroys human relationships, that sin is the cause of evil and despair and pain in this world. And so we see this coming out in Kierkegaard's writing. Sin is the action that accompanies anxiety and despair. And what makes sin so terrible is that it is before God. Thus, it emphasizes our littleness before Him. The opposite of sin is not virtue, but it's faith. So remember, when we move towards the nothingness, we're moving towards despair, sin, finiteness. the aesthetical. When we move towards the religious, the infinite, God, how do we do that? Remember, from In Fear and Trembling, it takes a leap of faith. That's how we move through the stages of life. That's how we move from the aesthetical to the ethical to the religious, is a leap of faith. Well, how do we move away from the nothingness and towards God? Again, by this leap of faith. But until we do that, until we move towards the religious, faith, the infinite, God, we will be in a constant state of despair. So the question is, how much despair do you want to be in? Do you want to be in so much despair you don't even realize it? Do you want to be in despair enough that you realize it but that you fight it? Or do you want to be in somewhat despair but trying to move away from it? That's essentially what Kierkegaard's asking us. And so faith is that the self in being itself and in willing to be itself rests transparently in God. In other words, faith is in this work, in sickness unto death, is us believing enough in the infinite to work towards being our true selves. And in this way, we can work towards moving beyond despair. That's the end of this module. I invite you to move on to the other module materials.